Welcome to another episode of IG Life with Astrid, your APD, and today I've got MENNO Henselmans with me for a second round, and the good news is it's going to be a little bit different. So it is going to be like a rapid Q&A on overrated, underrated in terms of hypertrophy, nutrition, and optimization for fat loss. So stay tuned, we're going to join him now. He might say, this is overrated, this is underrated, and this is the reason why I'm saying that. Make sure if you have any questions though, pop them in the comments because this is going to be really, really good. I'm so excited to have you. How are you doing?
Good. It's pretty steady here now in Brazil, and I got visa extension, so coming months I'll probably stay here and it's going to be pretty steady for once.
Learning some Portuguese?
Um pouco, sim.
Okay.
Não suficiente para conversar em alto nível.
Oh my God, I don't know anything about Portuguese. So I speak Spanish, and it's weird, like Brazil is the only country that speaks Portuguese. Let's get ready into this rapid Q&A. So the way it is going to work, I have 35 questions. Hopefully we can get through all of them. But basically the idea is to say this is overrated or underrated when it comes to hypertrophy, fat loss, or performance, muscle gain. And basically, you would like to explain shortly why you're saying that it's underrated or overrated in any case. So are you ready to roll this up?
Let's do it. Sounds fun.
All right. So with the first question, what do you think about vegan diets for hypertrophy and for fat loss? Overrated or underrated?
Probably overrated at this point. It's so popular, and they're certainly not an advantage. I'd say that the thing with vegan diets is there are many more considerations you have to factor into your diet plan compared to an omnivorous plan. But if you take all of those factors into account, it can be equally viable as an omnivorous diet. So certainly not an improvement over anything physically speaking, but it can certainly be viable.
Okay, so overrated?
Yeah, because it's so popular these days, and there's really not like much to support the magical benefits and everything.
Okay, perfect. Now, second question: supersets for a hypertrophy, are they overrated or underrated?
Definitely underrated. I'm a very big fan of supersets, although technically I don't do supersets. I call them combo sets, which is a bit like mini circuits, or sometimes called paired sets, where you do rest in between the sets. So I think a lot of people have sort of either you do them as one set bench press, 4 minutes rest, one set bench press, or you do bench press pull, and then 4 minutes rest. Bench press pull, 4 minutes rest. What I typically do is bench press, 1 minute rest, rows, 1 minute rest, bench press, etc. So it's or even like bench press, row, overhead press, calf raises. So if you string up your exercise like that, it saves a ton of time. Okay.
What is, if you had to define what a superset is for people who don't know what that is, what would you define it for? How do you define it?
The traditional definition of a superset is you do 2 sets of different exercises back to back. So instead of doing 1 set squats, rest, 1 set squats, instead you would do something like leg curl squats immediately after, and then you rest, and then leg curls, and immediately after squats, and then you rest.
Okay, and what would be the purpose of just making it more back-to-back rather than a separate sets?
Well, if you do an antagonist superset, which would be the leg curl to squat, which I'm actually a fan of, then there is something called antagonist potentiation, which means that if you're training one muscle group, then the muscle group with the opposite function, in this case, if you train the hamstrings and you fatigue them, then the quads actually get a potentiating effect. And this actually allows them to do more work, which should theoretically result in greater muscle growth, because it doesn't appear to be simply a neural thing or something. The muscle's actually doing more work.
Okay, awesome. Okay, third question. CrossFit for hypertrophy and for fat loss.
Overrated for both, probably. it's simply not good for muscle growth. It doesn't satisfy a lot of the basic principles of dynamic muscle contractions. It's very injurious. It's a lot more towards the strength endurance training, power training than pure hypertrophy. So for muscle growth, it's simply not a very effective way to go about it. It can be viable, but it's not the best way to do it. For fat loss, I think any training for fat loss is overrated because you're much better off following your Instagram and everything and get good diet tips than to train for it, because the energy expenditure really isn't that high, and the fancy numbers you see, they're not above basal. So you have to subtract basal energy expenditure as well, and then you're really not left with big effects. You know, if you go to Planet Fitness and they eat a slice of pizza before they go because they earned it, really you end up in basically net neutral energy balance. So you basically undid your workout right there.
Yeah, that's very true. So in conclusion, exercise by itself is not necessarily the best tool, especially when we talk about resistance training. You don't want to go to the gym to exercise for burning calories. You want to build muscle. You want to preserve muscle loss if you're in a calorie deficit, but not necessarily going with the idea that you're going to burn calories. Obviously, cardio could be a tool that you can utilize to sort of manipulate your energy deficit a little bit better, but it's not necessarily something that you need to always focus on as your main like training, because ideally you want to like prioritize your resistance training, right? And cardio utilizes as a tool, not like a must, like you would do with resistance training. What are your thoughts about that?
Definitely, I fully agree. More generally speaking, I would say that if anyone says you do something for fat loss, you should ask them, how does this help me either reduce energy intake, increase energy expenditure, or improve nutrient partitioning? And typically the increases in energy expenditure are not that great. Like if you talk about fat burners, they do help with fat loss in the sense that they will increase energy expenditure, but you're often looking at 5%. Even ephedrine, like high-dose ephedrine, which is not legal anymore in most countries, you're talking about maybe 10% increase in energy expenditure. Now that actually also suppresses your appetite, but that's the much more potent effect. So basically, there's basically no such thing, unless you're talking about DNP, but let's not go there. That's actually a good fat burner. The best things for dieting are appetite suppressants.
Perfect. Now, becoming stronger to get bigger, is that a thing that is overrated or underrated? So do you need to get stronger to actually get bigger?
It's a little controversial, but especially based on a recent study, I would say underrated. And in general, I think it's not ideal to train like a traditional bodybuilder where you completely neglect strength. And this recent study basically found that adding in strength work increased muscle growth. And even when they do it in a specific strength block, and in that block they didn't gain much muscle, but it potentiated muscle growth in the subsequent training phase. So that is actually a solid argument to incorporate some even very low, like 2 to 4 RM work in a bodybuilding program. It doesn't have to be much, but you should be developing some strength, I think. Plus,
okay,
if you're not getting stronger at all, you are almost certainly not getting bigger, because when a muscle with a bigger cross-sectional area, all else equal, is a stronger muscle. Like that's physical fact. So if you're not getting any strength, you have to wonder, you know, how could I be getting much bigger without getting strength? Typically, it's actually the opposite. It's much easier to gain quite a lot of strength. That doesn't really have to mean you've gained that much mass. So if you're actually gaining a substantial amount of mass, you should be getting substantially stronger.
Can you get stronger and not get very much of muscle size?
Yes, via neural adaptation. So basically, you can think of an analogy I like to use is strength is like the speed of a race car, and you can get the car faster either by making the driver smarter or more efficient, and that's like training the nervous system, like the motor cortex in your brain, or you can increase the size of the engine, and that's like making your muscles bigger. Like more formally put, strength is the combination of morphological and neurological factors. So if you train the driver, the nervous system, via, for example, 1RM work, speed work, technique work, you can get a lot stronger, but the total volume, the mechanical tension on the muscle fibers, is too low to stimulate much muscle growth.
So it's definitely, it could be both, but if you do get stronger, you can definitely grow better size too. Is that what you're saying?
Basically, I'd at least put it as, if you're completely neglecting strength work, you're probably not growing as fast as you could.
Okay. All right. Now let's get to the next question. Mind muscle connection for hypertrophy, is that overrated or underrated?
Overrated, I would say. Research generally finds that if you look at muscle activity research, which is the primary proposed mechanism, right? You think of your biceps while you're doing curls, and therefore the biceps activates more and therefore it grows more. However, we actually see that performance goes down and muscle activity levels typically do not increase. In fact, they only decrease in other muscle groups. So if, for example, you're doing chin-ups and you focus on your biceps, what happens is the biceps does not really activate much more. Well, you don't have a study on this specifically, but we have it for the bench press on some other muscle groups. Rather, some other muscle groups activate less. A recent study, for example, found that focusing on the lats during rows didn't activate the lats more. It just activates some other muscle groups less, including the arms. So you're isolating it a bit more, but you're not actually training the prime mover more. You're just training other muscle groups less. Plus, you're doing less total work. You're weaker. If you're squatting by focusing on your glutes, for example, you're not nearly squatting maximum weight. Now, if you're doing less work, how does that result in more muscle growth? So basically, I think the research for this is very uncompelling. It doesn't make much theoretical or mechanistic sense.
Okay, so what would be the reason to utilize my muscle connection more like towards intention, or like I am actually feeling the exercise in certain cases when you're probably not using a big load, that you can sort of think about how your muscle contracts and how you feel about the exercise, and whether you're actually targeting the right muscle. Because if you're doing biceps but you're feeling your shoulders, probably it's not the right exercise for you. So what would you say it is the main function for utilizing this particular mind-muscle connection?
Well, I think the truth behind the myth is that exercise technique is really important. So in the only long-term study we have on the mind-muscle connection, which is by Schoenfeld et al., if I'm not mistaken, I'm not sure if it was first author. He's like an author on everything. They found that for the biceps, it did increase muscle growth, but for leg extensions and the quads, it did not. And I think there's a very good explanation for that. You can try to weasel and cheat your way out of a leg extension, but it doesn't work. The leg extension is a completely fixed path. You're either moving the weight or you're not, and it doesn't matter if you're focusing on your quads or whatever else you're focusing on. If the weight's going up, it's your quads performing the movement. So that's the same with people saying, like, I don't feel my glutes during squats. Well, something's extending the hip. It sure as hell isn't your hamstrings, based on the research we have. So it kind of has to be the glutes. And whether you feel it or not really is a sensory subject. It's simply a subjective experience. It's not a direct indication of muscle stimulation. But for something like biceps curls, if you're focusing on the biceps, that may allow you to actually perform the movements correctly and focus on, using the biceps to move the weight rather than going like full Arnold and leaning back and heaving up the weight and turning it into sort of a supinated grip power clean. Because then, you're simply not training the right muscle groups to begin with. So I think that, some people use it that way. And basically I think it's more efficient to simply talk directly about technique rather than the mind-muscle connection, because that's a lot more vague.
Absolutely. I think that's the right point. Is basically really paying attention to the technique, because technique is, I think it is I guess it is the foundation of a really good activation and recruiting all the muscles you need without injuring yourself when you're performing an exercise. Now, let's move on. Even protein distribution, protein timing for hypertrophy and for fat loss. So separate entities, but how much is this overrated or underrated? Protein distribution.
All right. Yeah, let's separate them. That's better. Protein distribution, I would say underrated. There are actually, which are sort of buried at this point, but there are actually several studies that find that the timing of your calories or protein, even given the same daily totals, makes a big difference for muscle growth. And some research also fat loss, but that's probably more indirect. For example, and the general trend of those studies is that if you shift more nutrients in the anabolic window, and specifically the period in between your workout and bedtime, you get better results, better nutrient partitioning, and or better direct muscle growth, compared to if, for example, you train first thing or you train at late at night, but you consume most of your nutrients in the morning, and then you have nothing post-workout. That would be a very bad way to partition your calories. So basically, I think that the trend fits with the theme that during the anabolic window, which is actually a really long period, not like 1 hour, but more like up to 24 hours, or at least the first 12 hours are like peak muscle protein synthesis. That period is when your nutrients are more likely to be allocated towards muscle growth, and they're more likely to stimulate anabolism, mTOR, etc. So I think both mechanistically and based on those studies, it makes sense to shift more of your nutrients in this anabolic window period. It doesn't have to be all of your nutrients, but the distribution is slightly skewed towards that period. And I think especially if you have the opposite skew, that could be very detrimental. So based on the current climate of if it fits your macros and everything, I'd say this is underrated.
Okay. Would it be the same underrated for fat loss? Like if we're thinking about hypertrophy, it makes sense, but for fat loss, would you say that distribution of protein throughout the day evenly would make much more sense or much of a meaningful difference than just having 1 or 2 meals a day with a huge amount of protein?
It won't matter much. Based on one, I think in 2 of the studies or 1 of them, I'm sure in 1, it actually affected fat loss, but it did so mainly via nutrient partitioning. So the ratio of weight loss, I think it was in this study, was better. They maintained muscle mass better. And in that sense, it can affect fat loss, because if you're losing 1,000 calories from your body and you're now maintaining muscle mass, that's 1,000 calories that are now lost from fat mass. Now, building muscle is not going to have a big effect, because you're building such low amounts of muscle over time that 1,000 calories is not something you typically achieve in a day. So it can indirectly affect fat loss that way, but I think in practice it's not going to be a huge effect. For muscle growth, it's much more substantial than for fat loss. Okay,
so let me ask you one thing. When you talk about nutrient partitioning, what specifically do you refer to for those who don't understand what that is?
Nutrient partitioning is basically where the nutrients go. So if you consume a meal and those nutrients enter your body, and then your body basically decides where those nutrients go. And you can roughly distinguish that between either they go to your muscle mass or lean body mass, or towards fat mass. So if you have really poor nutrient partitioning, it's kind of similar to the P ratio, which is like a controversial topic from the last weeks. If you have a really bad nutrient partitioning, then that means all of your caloric surplus, for example, would go towards fat, or all of your caloric deficit would come from lean body mass, which would mean you lose only lean body mass or you gain only fat. Whereas if you have good nutrient partitioning, then it's the opposite. So what strength training essentially does is it improves nutrient partitioning a lot, compared to, say, cardio. Cardio helps for fat loss because it increases energy expenditure. And if you're at an energy deficit, because of that, you lose fat. If you're greater energy deficit, you lose more fat. But strength training also ensures that you're not losing muscle, and you may even build some muscle, so that all of your energy deficit ideally comes from fat.
Okay, and would it be any particular way or like external factors that could impact or affect nutrient partitioning? Let's say perhaps a particular condition like insulin resistance or Hashimoto's or PCOS. Do you think in women or like even in men, like if they have a particular hormonal condition or external environmental factor could affect that nutrient partitioning? If you're like doing everything right and you're still doing your resistance training and you're focusing on doing the specific mechanistic exercises to address that nutrient partitioning. Would that be possible that things around you could affect that?
Definitely, a lot of things, and some of those even interact. For example, you mentioned PCOS and carb intolerance, and we actually have research showing that women with PCOS have better nutrient partitioning on lower carb diets, or at least lower insulin index diets. So that's where the combination of those two factors, the nutrient partitioning, and more broadly speaking, almost everything affects nutrient partitioning. Protein intake affects nutrient partitioning a lot. As we just discussed, protein timing and calorie timing can also impact nutrient partitioning. So nutrient partitioning is almost basically the final end goal of any good program, and almost all of the parameters in your program, diet and training variables, all those influence your nutrient partitioning. The better your final nutrient partitioning because of all of those factors, the more efficient and effective your whole training and diet program is going to be.
Okay, perfect. Now let's move on to the next one. Refeeds for hypertrophy and for fat loss. Are they overrated or underrated?
Overrated. Sure. We touched on it last time a bit, so I think people can go for a full explanation towards that one. But yeah, I think especially for strength trainees, it's you just lose a lot of time. The research are really uncompelling. We have a study currently in the final stages of writing it up with Bill Campbell. I think you also interviewed him, so you can also check that for some details. And we found very uncompelling benefits, specifically for strength trainees.
I hope you enjoyed this episode, and make sure you subscribe to my channel and hit the bell button so I can provide you with more information every time I upload a video. So stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you so much.
Next one, carb cycling. Is that overrated or underrated for hypertrophy? And perhaps we can definitely like target fat loss. Are they different, and how this is potentially overrated or underrated?
I can be simple about that one. It's overrated for anything. Doesn't matter what. It doesn't work. So basically one of those things that I think really only Lyle McDonald has provided at least some some theory for it, but nobody's actually done it successfully. It's a major hassle. There is absolutely zero direct research support for it. It doesn't make much sense. And in fact, the only two studies, one of which is unpublished, one published, specifically on ketogenic carb cycling, basically going out of keto in the weekend, found a trend towards detrimental effects. Because the theory for that would be, if you're going in and out of keto, you're too low on carbs for the majority of the time to sustain performance, whereas you're also not keto adapted. So you're sort of in this worst of both worlds mix. And exogenous ketones and the like also seem to actually provide a bit of a worst of both worlds rather than a best of both worlds.
Okay. Would you be thinking about that perhaps as a tool you could use in certain situations, most of the time targeted to athletes, that you can sort of utilize more carbohydrates for certain days that they might have a race or they might have a competition, or just like a preparation for it on a like high or large amount of training volume or intensity? Is that something that can be considered like useful for that carb cycling, or is it still something that you would say nah?
I know there is research on like train low, compete high, those kind of carb cycling factors. Those could have merit. I don't know. My expertise is fat loss, muscle growth, strength development. I'm really not well versed on the endurance training literature, so I'd say that you have to ask someone else.
All right, let's move on to the next one. Variety in exercise selection for hypertrophy and for fat loss.
Overrated, I'm tempted to say. It really depends on which camp you're sort of in, because if you ask people that are in like 5x5 or strong lifts, kind of camps, then it's definitely underrated. They need a lot more exercise variety. But bodybuilders tend to overdo it and go for variety just for the sake of variety. And I think it's important to have complementary exercise selection. Hamstrings, you want something like a leg curl and a Romanian deadlift. So you want, in general, exercises that stimulate stretch-mediated hypertrophy and, in general, achieve high mechanical tension. And you want to stimulate all muscle fibers of the muscle and the different heads. So for the hamstrings, you need a leg curl variant. Otherwise, the short head of the biceps femoris is going to be left understimulated. And for the delts, you want something in the front, side, and rear planes, so that you hit the front, side, rear delt, and you could even separate those fibers more. There's, depending on which research you look at, there's like 11 potential different anatomical areas with different innervation. So smart exercise selection, and for most muscles you do need at least 2, sometimes 3 exercises. You don't need 10 different biceps curls. It's the common way people go when they think, oh, you need a lot of variety, like, oh, I can do some more different curls. It's amazing in general to see how creative men get when you ask them to do more types of biceps curls. And for quads, it's basically squats, leg extensions, and ideas.
Okay. So definitely underrated for some and overrated for others. Or would you say, what would be your final verdict?
If I had to say one, I'd go with overrated, because probably bodybuilding is the biggest camp where they talk about exercise variety. And
Okay.
that population side, they overdo it a bit.
Okay. Is there any particular effect in exercise selection and variations for fat loss, or is nothing underrated or overrated?
I mean, at least a tiny effect, in the sense that a better exercise selection would improve nutrient partitioning, and stimulating muscle growth in itself stimulates energy expenditure. So there probably is an effect, but it's really small, more like an effect over the course of months, rather than a real effect like what you're going to notice this week. So generally, definitely overrated. Exercise, even exercise selection as a whole, won't impact fat loss nearly as much as your diet.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I was thinking that perhaps it is, again, it could be a tool for like managing fatigue. Perhaps like when you select certain exercises, if you feel like you might not be able to perform them as well, maybe if you make or look for something that is potentially similar, that targets the same muscle, but perhaps it's not as fatiguing, might just allow you to keep showing up to the gym and still getting the training done, even if it's not what you planned. So you have like a more variety to select from when it comes to managing fatigue or like performance itself. What do you think about that?
Yeah, if you're talking more of fatigue in the sense of RPE and motivation, really psychological fatigue, those factors can certainly matter. For like physical fatigue, neuromuscular fatigue, research has actually found surprisingly little difference between different exercises and how fatiguing they are. You can have wildly different RPE ratings, so perceived effort, between, for example, deadlifts and bench press. They actually stimulate in the muscles that they train. They cause a similar amount of neuromuscular fatigue. There have now been, I think, at least 4 studies on the squat, bench press, deadlift, and one study included like 10 different exercises. And the differences are really small, typically not significant. So while some exercises drain you a lot more than others, because of how much they fatigue your muscles, the differences are actually not very large.
Okay. Okay. Next one. Body type diets for fat loss.
Definitely overrated, because they simply don't work at all. Actually wrote a detailed article on this on my website about endomorph, mesomorph, ectomorph, how they influence. And there is actually a tiny bit of truth behind those myths, in the sense that, for example, your total frame size does actually matter. People with a large frame size, basically a large skeleton, typically gain muscle easier than others. That's also why, if you think of any high-level strongman or powerlifter, they are all built like a house. It's actually, as a small anecdote, when I was in the speaking at Body Power, you're in the green room, which is sort of the name for the VIP room there. I met Ronnie Coleman and a lot of the strongman and like a lot of the most famous people in fitness. And when you see, for example, Ronnie Coleman, it's like, whoa, that guy is huge, but he pales in comparison to the sheer size of the strongman. Like the strongmen are they are physically very tall. Like I'm tall, I'm 6'1", but I'm a dwarf compared to those guys. And simply the shoulder width and the total size of these guys is absolutely insane. So, yeah, then you can really see that frame size does actually matter, but the whole endo-ecto thing is more what you have become rather than what your genetics force you to be.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I think you can change, like transition from one body type to another. If you do train, the resistance training, you diet, like if you're consider endomorph, is that those ones that are like bigger and have more body fat. And then you could transition easily to mesomorph if you lost fat and you did resistance training and you gain more muscle. So you can transition from one to another. Next one. Okay, ketogenic diet for hypertrophy and for fat loss. Overrated or underrated?
I'd say overrated for fat loss because based on the majority of research, they don't actually stimulate much more fat loss or any more fat loss on a calorie and protein equated basis. Most of the benefits for fat loss are stimulated by reduction in appetite and a reduction subsequently in energy intake via food restriction and lower appetite. We consume fewer calories. Even in studies, which brings us to the next point, for muscle growth, I'd say it's underrated because the problem that we see in research when they try to bulk on a keto diet, they simply don't get the calories in. So that is a real practical problem. If for you that is not a problem, like you're not a hard gainer, you have a big appetite, you have no issues, just eating lots of fatty meat and everything, then I'd say the potential for muscle growth is equal to higher carb diets based on the majority of studies. So it's practically infeasible, especially I think at the point where intake starts exceeding protein intake, because at that point you have to consume foods that contain neither carbs nor protein, but do have a lot of fat, which basically means you're forced to drink olive oil or put a whole lot of butter on everything. And then you get crazy stuff like people putting butter in their coffee. But a weird thing that nobody would do, of course. So, at that point, it becomes just really practically infeasible. But theoretically, it's still actually good. And based on the isocaloric research, it's actually not detrimental for muscle growth.
Okay, awesome. Next one. Interset stretching for hypertrophy. Is that overrated or underrated?
Overrated. I'd say that we have only a little bit of research on this. Most of the original research, they cite the study where they hang weights on the wings of birds, and they forget to mention that it's a study on birds. And all that study really shows is that mechanical tension drives muscle growth, because if you get an untrained person and you put all of weights on their arms, then they're going to get bigger arms because they have to lift those weights all the time. So there's really not much more to it than that. And we have 1 or 2 studies on interset stretching in humans that are actually worth something. And one of them found a benefit, but it simply added weighted stretching, and it was weighted stretching. So that's basically isometric contractions, since they simply did more work. The other study found a benefit, but they did interset stretching within the same time period, which should weaken you and also is basically doing more work. So they did the same amount of total work, which you would normally never see. I mean, if you're doing a set of dumbbell flies and then very intense stretching of the pecs, and then for your next set, you should be weaker. Then otherwise something is wrong. So if you're managing to do the same amount of work, you're basically making the workouts more effortful, and that's why you gain more muscle. Look at the effects on static stretching, on muscle activation, and muscle growth long term. They're actually decidedly negative. In fact, we have, I think, 2 studies. I'm sure there's one, and I think there's one more showed it, that static stretching, either before or during your workouts, decreases muscle growth because it decreases the muscle activity levels and basically makes the muscles relax when you actually want them to be very active during the workout.
Okay. Would you say, for those that might don't know, don't understand, would you say that interset mobilities would have a different effect, or would be the same conclusion for like inter-stretching?
You mean like mobility work?
Yeah, like dynamic stretching or like just mobility. Maybe you're training legs, but you could do like some mobility around the ankles or around the hips or around the shoulders to grab better the bar. I don't know. Is that something that could be affecting or interacting with your performance or even muscle growth or a specific objective for your reason for you to train?
I think it would be more neutral, and I'd say it certainly won't stimulate muscle growth. And my main issue with it is typically that when people speak of greater mobility or flexibility, you always have to wonder, like, what concretely are you increasing range of motion in? So if it actually helps you squat deeper, then that's great. But if you're doing the same movement, for example, I've heard someone quite recently say that stretching of the pecs increases flexibility for the bench press. And I'm like, do you have trouble getting the bar to your chest? Because that's as low as it can go. And like anything else, you're not really increasing the physical range of motion of your movement. So it's probably not going to do anything.
That makes sense. Now, okay, time of the day to work out. Do you think the timing of the day to work out makes a huge difference? Is that overrated or underrated?
I'd say underrated, because a lot of people don't even consider it at all. But the overall literature is that the consistency is very important, but the exact timing may still matter a bit. I think we have 3 studies finding a trend, and I think 2 of those were unpublished, and only 1 study finding a significant benefit towards evening or for evening workouts or afternoon compared to in the morning, even when you're training consistently at the same time. So it may matter, and the consistency is the most important.
Yeah, so it's better to do whatever you can do as long as you do it consistently. If it works for you training in the afternoons, then do it in the afternoons. If you can do it in the mornings, do it in the mornings. But most times, like the thing that is that research is backing up that perhaps you might see better performance, or is that better benefits? In what sense would you say it is superior to training in the afternoons? What would be the significance in those studies that are supporting, perhaps if you're training in the evenings, you're going to get more out of it as if you train in the mornings?
The main benefit would be you're simply stronger. And most world records, for example, are broken in the afternoon to any other time of day. And greater performance should result in you doing more work and thereby probably result in a bit more muscle growth over time and strength development. However, there is some more mechanistic research showing that there may also be intramuscular circadian rhythm factors. So basically, your muscles also seem to have a biorhythm, a 24-hour biorhythm, and certain anabolic processes may also be more active in the afternoon, early evening period. But that's still pretty speculative at this point.
Okay, makes sense. All right, let's move on to the next one. Number of meals per day for muscle growth. Overrated or underrated?
At this point, I'd say overrated. I think it doesn't matter that much. We have a couple studies, including a recent one actually, finding that 3 meals is basically enough. And a couple also a meta-analysis showing that where people on average ate, I think, 4 times, and then it didn't matter if you add the protein between meals or with meals. And a couple other studies, one really good unpublished study, the Norwegian Meal Frequency Project, not to be confused with the Norwegian Training Frequency Project. It found that between 3 and 6 meals, if anything, there was a trend for greater muscle growth with the 3 meals compared to the 6 meals. I don't think that makes any sense. but at least it's strong evidence that you don't need the 6. You do need the 3, based on, I think it was still 2020. There was a study, I reviewed it on my site, showing that if you have just 2 meals, then even a low-protein third meal is not as good as actually adding a full third meal. It does seem you need the 3 meals for maximum growth.
What about training intensity for hypertrophy? Overrated or underrated?
Overrated, probably. Most research finds that the muscle hypertrophy zone, or the optimal muscle growth zone of like 6 to 12 reps, which was traditionally the idea, it's more like 4 to 30, so like 85 to 30% of 1RM. And then on a set-by-set basis, as long as you're going close to failure, the muscle growth stimulated is actually on average equal. And there are still some reasons to incorporate both, as we talked about earlier, to stimulate strength, which may potentiate muscle growth, for example. And high rep work is a very joint-friendly way to potentially also preferentially stimulate type 1 muscle fibers or some other anabolic processes based on some Russian research. Different anabolic growth pathways can be activated. And also some Western research finds that a variety of rep ranges may augment muscle growth. So, it's not the case that it doesn't matter at all, but you certainly shouldn't restrict yourself to like the 6 to 12 rep range. That may actually be more detrimental than helpful than using a wider range of rep ranges.
What about progressive overload? Is that overrated or underrated for hypertrophy?
I'd say underrated. It doesn't matter per se, but the thing with progressive overload is that many people think it stimulates muscle growth. It doesn't. It's a measure of muscle growth, more, if anything. So the fact that you can do more reps or lift more weight than the last time means that the muscle has adapted. That's a sign there is at least strength development, and likely, if you're in energy surplus, also some muscle growth that caused you to become stronger. More the fact that you're observing the progressive overload is a sign that the program is working and likely stimulating at least strength development and probably also muscle growth over time, rather than really being the key. So a lot of people go wrong with progressive overload. They, for example, think it's sort of a necessity. Even when they don't get stronger, they add sets or they cut the rest periods. That's the worst, because then you're actually decreasing the stimulus for muscle growth. But they're sort of forcing themselves to make it harder, and then you can actually just drag yourself deeper into the hole. So, for example, you're not progressing because your volume is too high, and then your idea is, well, I need progressive overload, so I'm just going to add sets and more sets. You're just going to dig yourself deeper into the recovery hole, and it's just going to get worse and worse.
So would you say that perhaps how would you define, to put it very clear, what progressive overload is, for those that might not know what it is?
You can define it in 2 ways. I like more the original definition that you are progressively, that's the most literal definition, is you're progressively increasing the load that you can lift. But you could also have sort of forced progressive overload, and that would be things like adding sets, cutting rest periods. That's the definition I would not be fan of, and I think doesn't make much sense. Rather, you want to observe progressive overload as an indication that your program is working as intended.
Okay. And could you change, like progressive overload could mean that you're adding weight, or you're changing the intensity, you're doing additional reps or additional sets. How do you program for progressive overload in a very simple way?
The simplest way is by far the best, I would say. And that's, you simply want to lift more weight or do more reps with a given weight. And in fact, in my clients, I say that no other form of progressive overload actually counts. I want to see them objectively get stronger. And if they're not, then the program needs to be adjusted. Because like I said, if it's basically impossible to gain a substantial amount of muscle growth if you're not getting stronger. If you were getting stronger, you should have been bigger. Or if you were getting bigger, you should have been stronger.
Isolation exercises for hypertrophy.
Overrated, probably, because a lot of people think they're necessary. And in general, muscle tissue is, as my friend Børge Fagerli from Norway used to say, muscle is just a dumb piece of meat. It registers mechanical tension, and it doesn't register whether you are holding a kettlebell or a dumbbell or your new Bowflex or a ring and it's just lifting body weight. It's, it just responds to the internal stimuli. So whether you do that with an isolation or a compound exercise, there have actually been a few studies now that compare the two directly. And they find that it doesn't matter per se whether it's an isolation or a compound exercise. The hamstrings, they don't know what the quads are doing. They just register tension. If there's enough tension, they grow. Whether you got that tension by also training the glutes at the same time, it doesn't matter, because basically every muscle is like Vegas. What happens in the muscle stays in the muscle. There are very few systemic factors. It's mostly locally regulated.
And what do you think would be a good ratio between perhaps combining compound movements and isolation movements for hypertrophy?
I mean, it doesn't matter per se, I'd say. However, isolation exercises have the huge benefit that you can stimulate one muscle group and not have more volume for others. Because ideally, in an optimized program, what you want to do, you want to set an optimized volume, a target volume for every muscle group. And if you're only using compound exercises, it becomes really hard to, for example, not completely overtrain the triceps and the front delts, and to neglect things like the long head of the triceps and the short head of the biceps femoris, because all these other exercises, for example, most compound exercises would also train the glutes, and you would actually overtrain the glutes before you've reached enough hamstring volume, for example, or your only triceps exercises would be presses, and those don't train the long head of the triceps very well. So you would get into the scenario where you're probably overtraining the lateral head, but still undertraining the long head of the triceps. That's why you need something like overhead tricep extensions or skull overs to specifically target the long head of the triceps, and ideally also in a stretched position. You need both. The ratio doesn't matter per se. I mean, you probably can't go wrong with something close to 50-50 in that sense.
Managing inflammation for hypertrophy.
Underrated, for sure, because most people don't even realize it matters at all. And the literature at this point is actually quite compelling that it does matter. In strength trainings, we don't have that much research. We know, for example, that excess vitamin C and E intake, which is in many multivitamins, also some pre and post workouts, which would be the worst timing to overdose on vitamin C, actually blunt muscle growth. And anti-inflammatories can have the same effect. So many supplements that people think are just, more antioxidants is good, like more is better. Actually, it can directly reduce muscle growth. And there are quite some supplements that at this point are still in the stage of they could actually also be detrimental. Resveratrol, curcumin. So, yeah, you can have too much anti-inflammatory effect, especially post-workout. You can also definitely, especially if you're overweight, you can have too much systemic inflammation, which blunts the acute signal of the muscles after the workout for muscle repair. Basically, inflammation is your muscle saying, we need help. We need the immune system to pay attention here. And if there's inflammation everywhere, then the muscle or the immune system is not going to respond much to the inflammation in the muscle because it's everywhere. Rather than, what you want is you want low inflammation everywhere so that you train a muscle. There's a lot of inflammation there, and then the immune system knows, okay, we're going to repair that muscle because that's where it's needed.
Okay, awesome. Sugar intake for hypertrophy, overrated or underrated?
Overrated. It doesn't matter that much directly. Like if your diet is really crap and you're actually getting systemic inflammation, then it's bad. But if you're, for example, 10%, 5% of your diet, some sugar to it, it's really not going to impair muscle growth or really affect it. For fat loss, the main reason would even be appetite rather than sugar inherently being fattening. Sugar is just very caloric and very poorly satiating, so it's very easy to overeat it. And even if you fit it into your macros, you're left hungry, which is not sustainable. So sugar itself is really not as bad as all people think. But in practice, it's still problematic.
What about having sugar or high glycemic index carbohydrates straight after training?
Doesn't matter. From the research we have, even fat intake also doesn't matter. The thing is that protein intake makes the carbohydrates mostly redundant. So you only need an insulin concentration, I think it's 20, not sure how they measure it. But if you get like 20 grams of whey, you're crossing that level of insulin production. So if you're getting a sufficient protein intake post-workout, you're getting enough insulin that the carbohydrates become redundant. And it's the insulin that decreases protein breakdown and slightly stimulates protein synthesis under some context. So really, as long as you're getting the protein, whether you add carbs or not, there have been several studies on this, the amount of carbs or the presence of carbs at all doesn't really matter that much.
Okay, so what you're saying is that it is a bit overrated to consume carbohydrates, especially like maltodextrin or very high glycemic index carbohydrates straight away with protein in your anabolic window?
Definitely. I think it's actually very poor practice. It's mostly supplement companies trying to sell you sugar for the price of steak. And you're just wasting a lot of calories, empty calories, on dextrose, which is really just sugar. And it's a waste of calories that you could have spent much more enjoyably, much more satiatingly, much more nutritiously.
And would that be the same answer for adding just normal carbohydrates? Like, do you need to eat carbohydrates straight away after training? Or does that make any difference?
In some circumstances, it can matter. But for someone that does strength training and only strength training, and the carbohydrate intake is consistent, not much. I mean, I do recommend a target, even in keto diets, I recommend a targeted ketogenic diet, with at least 10 gram carbs extra pre and post workout, typically. So you do want some carbs, even in ketosis, but in any practical diet, it's very easy to consume that amount of carbs, even if you're not paying attention to it at all.
Now, menstrual cycle periodization for hypertrophy and fat loss. Overrated or underrated?
Underrated for sure, because a lot of people don't. It's one of those things that we actually have several studies showing it matters and it works, but people are very reluctant to implement any of it. And it's one of the few advanced programming techniques for women that really makes a difference. So I'd say it's something all women should consider for sure.
How do you go about talking to women and asking questions about when is your menstrual cycle coming, to sort of sit with them and organize and plan their training program? How do you get these questions out to just break the ice but don't feel like it is a little bit too intrusive or like, I don't know, uncomfortable?
Mm-hmm. So in my intake form, I ask about if they have a menstrual cycle and if it's regular. And I do put a note, like, if you're not comfortable with these kind of questions, you don't have to answer it. We just pretend it's a non-factor. But it does compromise my ability to help you. And my experience is that the vast majority of women do note these things. And if you're professionally casual about it, simply don't make it awkward. That's the thing with awkwardness. If you don't make it awkward, it's not. So just ask them directly. So when does your menstruation start? Then it really doesn't have to be a sensitive question. It's just a very factual, objective question. I often compare myself more to a consultant or a doctor with clients in that sense, where nobody would be hesitant to tell their doctor when they menstruate, right? So as long as you're not, the creepy male PT that like wants to know if you can take your progress photos in more revealing clothing, and he wants to know like when are you menstruating, or be like super awkward about it. It really doesn't have to be awkward. So I think just be casual, direct about it. It's really not a big deal in my experience.
I agree. I just think that for some male personal trainers, they might feel like, how do I approach this? Or how do I ask my female questions, the right questions? And they don't feel like I'm trying to get into their like intimate parts, or like these conversations are a little bit intimate. So it might be just sometimes a little bit of a barrier for getting more questions and more information out of your clients that could be potentially beneficial for your programming and getting them the best performance out of your program.
Yeah, I think it's mostly the guys that make it awkward, because my experience is that women really aren't awkward about it. Just make it the same as if it was woman to woman talk. Like,
yeah. Protein consumption for satiety, is this overrated or underrated?
Overrated. I've actually offered a study on this with where we directly investigated this in strength trainees, of if there are benefits to satiety of going higher than 1.8 gram per kilogram per day. And there aren't. There are definitely benefits based on a multitude of studies of going up to the point of sufficiency. And protein leverage basically explains why there is this discrepancy. And it seems that the body has mechanisms in place that detect if your amino acid intake or protein intake is sufficient. And when it's insufficient, it keeps you hungry. And we see this in animals very clearly. Basically, the body really wants you to consume enough protein because it doesn't have a storage reservoir like it does for carbs, glycogen, or fat, adipose tissue. There's muscle mass and lean mass, but it's a very ineffective process and energetically inefficient to store a lot of muscle mass just to store protein. So it seems that if your protein intake is not enough, then you stay hungry. But if it is enough, then protein becomes just like any other source of calories. And it doesn't matter anymore. And most protein sources are still relatively caloric. I mean, if you compare to like zucchini or tomatoes, you can have a pound of tomatoes for just about 100 calories. So that's, a tiny, tiny amount of cooked chicken breast, which really doesn't satiate much at all, especially not if it's with a good sauce and it's nice. I think that's also a reason why people sometimes mistake protein, and they're thinking chicken breast, like dry chicken breast without seasoning. And that's just so hard to eat and unpalatable that it's satiating in the sense of you want to stop eating, but it's not actually that physically appetite suppressing.
Well, Menno, thank you so much for coming to this Q&A. I think it was really, really cool that we were over lots of different questions and we sort of dispel some myths and facts and really get into the good information that you always bring to us. Thank you so much for coming. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for being watching. I appreciate you so much. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions or any comments, please comment below and I'll be sure I'll answer to this as soon as I can.